So for those of you who were not able to join us last evening, we had a very provocative, I think, opening talk by Phil Clayton. And I think today promises to be a very exciting and engaging day of insights and conversations. So I'm delighted that you can be with us. Hopefully you will persevere throughout the whole day, because it's bound to get better and better after the last talk.
There's a punchline.
I'm going to invite the Philosophy Honor Club to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor Steve Fuller. So if our Philosophy Club members would come, please, to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Libby O'Brien.
And I'm James Pennick.
And we're philosophy students here at Villanova. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Steve Fuller, the Auguste Comte Chair in Social Epistemology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick in England. You may already guess from his title that his background is unusual for a philosopher, or a philosopher of science in particular, which he identifies as his primary area of research. Dr. Fuller graduated from Columbia University in history and sociology before gaining a master's of philosophy in history and philosophy of science from Cambridge, and a PhD from Pittsburgh, also in history and philosophy of science. No doubt, in part, due to his special training, his work tends to be socially and historically richer than that of most philosophers of science, and more philosophically sophisticated than that of other sociologists. He credits his academic supervisors at Pittsburgh for speaking comfortably on the continuities between theology and science throughout the modern period. These conversations, along with his original Jesuit training, especially in the philosophy of Teilhard de Chardin, prepare him to take seriously the notion that there is scientific evidence of intelligent design in nature. The chair that he holds at Warwick is the world's first chair in social epistemology, for good reason. Social epistemology is a movement and research program that Dr. Fuller founded in the 1980s. It is also the name of a journal he founded with Tyler and Francis in 1987, plus was the name of his first and now well over 20 books. Social epistemology, as he understands it, is inherently interdisciplinary, concerned with both empirical research into how knowledge is produced and transmitted, and normative considerations about its assessments and validation. It is also worth mentioning here that the journal is going to be housed at Villanova University for at least the next 5 years, under the editorship of Professor Tyner of philosophy.
Major areas of his research are the future of the university and critical intellectuals, the emergence of intellectual property in the information society, the interdisciplinary challenges in the natural and social sciences, the political and epistemological consequences of the new biology, the nexus between science and religion, and in recent years he has been particularly concerned with the future of humanity, or humanity 2.0, as he refers to his own vision of transhumanism. His most recent books are Post-Truth, Knowledge is a Power Game, The Academic Caesar, The University Leadership is Hard, Knowledge, the Philosophical Quest in History, and The Proactionary Imperative, A Foundation for Transhumanism, co-authored with Veronica Lipinski. To name but a few of his many distinctions, he is a Fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences, a Fellow of the European Academy of Social Sciences, a Senior Research Fellow at the Breakthrough Institute, the leading eco-modernist think tank, an Affiliate Scholar at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, the leading transhumanist think tank, and since 2013, he has been a member of the science and technology platform EDGE. Please welcome Steve Fuller, Panpsychism 2.0, Why It's Worth Another Shot.
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank all of you. So if you want to hold me accountable to anything I'm saying, and you don't get around to do it now, since this is all being recorded, you can go through what I've said later on. This is my email address. First of all, I want to thank Georg for inviting me for this, and it is an area which I think is actually quite interesting, quite important, especially from a metaphysical standpoint about where we're going as human beings. And this is kind of the spirit in which I'm addressing this topic. Because as was mentioned in the introduction, right, in recent years in particular, I've been talking about transhumanism and the future of humanity, especially given all the developments in science and technology that's been taking place, that's allowing us to enhance ourselves as human beings, at least in a physical way, and perhaps even a mental way. But also, of course, the challenges that are being posed to the human condition by the increasing force of concerns about animal rights, even plant rights to a certain extent, but in any case, some kind of re-engagement with nature at a kind of deeper level than had been the case for most of the modern era. So all these things are kind of on the table now, and it's in this context that I'm going to be talking about panpsychism, okay? I'm not sure you're going to like everything I'm going to have to say, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. One of the things that was mentioned in the introduction, which I hadn't realized, but is quite relevant to how I approach these matters, is I think for those of you who do philosophy in particular, there is a tendency to talk about different positions in philosophy in a very ahistorical way. Okay, and I would say this is especially true of the philosophy of mind, okay, or cognitive science as it's known in its more high-tech form. And here I think what I want to do in the talk is, in a sense, to go back to the roots and why anyone thought panpsychism was such a great idea in the first place. And so basically, panpsychism at a sort of very fundamental level, okay, so right, anyone who believes in panpsychism believes at least this, right, that there's some sense in which mind permeates the universe. All right? The question is, in virtue of what? To what extent in various parts of the universe, right? Are there differences, right? There are all these kinds of questions one can raise. But the basic idea, and the spirit in which panpsychism is offered as a kind of general metaphysics, is the idea that mind is in some way dominant. Okay? Which immediately raises the question about matter. Where's matter in panpsychism? Okay? And I think this is kind of the spirit, you might say, in which we should enter into this kind of thinking. Okay? I want to draw a distinction here, and this distinction, to my mind, at least in the contemporary literature, is not drawn very strongly, but was in fact strongly drawn in the late 19th century when panpsychism was kind of a thing. Now again, if I tell you the whole universe, is full of mind, and then the question is how is it being distributed in some sense, you're likely to think that this is primarily a theological position, but in fact this was a scientific position. Okay? So I want to put that on the table. Then in the late 19th century, this position was part of a family of positions that in philosophy was generally known as neutral monism. Okay? And this was the idea that whatever the nature of reality is, it's one thing. It's one thing. Monism, right? Monism. This is quite an important position from a political standpoint. Now you might say, well, yeah, maybe, no, what? Why was this issue such a big deal in the 19th century, the late 19th century? And this actually had to do with what dualism, right? The idea that there's not just one substance, but there are two substances, and this is where typically mind and matter, right? Spirit and matter, whatever, right? This distinction gets made, right? What did dualism mean in the late 19th century? Well, dualism basically meant a kind of, you might say, not to see, and this is where not like the way it is today. Because when we think about dualism in the philosophy of mind today, we're thinking about so-called Cartesian dualism. Right? This is the idea that, in some sense, mind and matter are somehow radically different things, and then the question is how you put them together. This is the way in which, in contemporary philosophy of mind, Cartesian dualism is normally understood, and then the question becomes, is this really a good starting point from which to talk about the nature of mind? And then materialists immediately flood the debate and say no. Okay? But this is not actually what was the debate in the late 19th century when panpsychism came into being. It was a different debate. And the kind of dualism that was relevant back then was Contine Dualism. And that's a different thing. Okay? That's a different thing. So Immanuel Kant, the greatest of modern philosophers, made a big deal about the difference between things as they appear to us and things as they are in themselves. Right? There was this distinction. That's the dualism, the Kantian dualism. And there was a sense in Kant that never the twain shall meet. Now you see, this kind of view actually sat very well with certain religious standpoints. A separate but equal doctrine with regard to science and reality. Okay? So, you know about the separate but equal doctrine in the United States? Right? Blacks and whites are equal, but they can have separate facilities. Very much part of the way in which things were in this country, even after, the 13th, 14th Amendment, whatever, until the 1960s. Well, this is a kind of view that Kant was taken to be supporting in the late 19th century. Right? So what science dealt with was basically the world as it appeared, the appearances, the phenomena, the things that you can summarize through empirical investigation, right, through experimentation, through generalization, right, scientific laws were about all this kind of stuff. But then there was this other world, right, the real world, the world that makes this possible. And that we can know nothing about, right? And this is what Kant called the Noumenon. Some of you who've studied philosophy will know this. That was the dualism. And that was a dualism that neutral monism was against. And panpsychism was one version, one sort of neutral monism that was against the separate but equal doctrine between science and religion that was very much in place in the late 19th century. And for those of you who don't know what the significance of the late 19th century is generally from a kind of sociological standpoint, especially in Europe, is this is generally the period when the school systems, which previously had been run by the churches of the various countries, get very systematically turned over to secular authorities. Okay, so there's a question about where, you really do start to see a massive institutional sea change where, Catholic schools are just private schools. They're not the primary means by which the public is actually instructed. Okay? So that's part of what's going on in the late 19th century as a kind of sociological correlate to this kind of development. Okay? So people who advocated neutral monism were generally speaking scientists who had aspirations to take over the functions of religion. I think that it would be fair to say. Right? And you see, when we say that today, and we think Richard Dawkins, right, we think of it as completely about demystification and atheism and all this kind of stuff, the denial of the spiritual, blah, 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 right? That's kind of how we think about that idea today, the idea of science taking over the functions of religion. But this is not the case when we talk about neutral monism in the late 19th century, okay? They basically wanted to, in a way, update, modernize a lot of the stuff that, in fact, religious people had talked about. So when we thought, nowadays, to give you a sense of a kind of thing that's kind of in the spirit of neutral monism, is something like neurotheology. Right? This idea that in some sense you want to find a kind of, material basis for spiritual experience. And so one of the things that was very much part of the whole neutral monist framework in the late 19th century was concerned about, paranormal phenomena, right? So all this stuff that we're still very preoccupied about, parapsychology, right? That all comes from there. That's where it comes from, right? Where people are actually trying to find scientific basis for all this spiritual stuff, right? And they're open to the issue of that there are actually entities, there are spirits, right? But we can access them scientifically. Okay? And of course, for those of you who know, William James, right? He's one of the guys, and he's not the only one by any means, who's on board with this. He's going to take this seriously. Okay? And so you have to understand panpsychism is kind of part of that sort of intellectual movement that's going on. But there's a sense in which one is believing that science is replacing theology, but sort of in the spirit of a natural successor. Right? In other words, not saying that it's pure superstition or anything like that. So in that respect, they have a much more sophisticated vision of what theology has to offer than, let's say, at least certain stereotype views of what the Enlightenment was about. Okay, so in the 18th century, right, Dark Ages, the Enlightenment as this period where we go beyond superstition and tradition and all that, right, this is a very kind of common early modern way of talking about stuff. But when you get to the late 19th century, you actually have this much more sophisticated sort of view going on, where in some sense, science is in a better position to investigate the sorts of things that theology has traditionally taken to be its own domain. And that's neutral monism. And there are lots of different versions of it. Okay? And some of them nowadays we would call reductionism. This is the interesting point, because now we've got this kind of, in the way in which we do philosophy of mind and metaphysics and stuff like that, right, we have very kind of supposedly clear ways of dividing up the positions and so forth, and reductionism is seen as kind of a materialist position and anti-spiritual and so forth. But in fact, reductionism should be seen as actually one way in which neutral monism got articulated in the 20th century. But it comes from the same kind of family tree that panpsychism comes from. Okay? Because there's going to be a question, right? Reductionism and panpsychism basically share the idea that at the end of the day, everything is of the same stuff. So how do you characterize that stuff? Right? And so this is where the debate actually happened, right? And so in that respect, there was this kind of general view that in some sense science and theology should always be on the same side, and in some sense they're dealing with the same questions, and you would kind of want a kind of convergence of methods over time. That was kind of what the vision of, now what that would look like as a political practice varied a lot between the various kind of neutral monists, okay? And so here I want to draw a distinction between panpsychism and another view that was on the table, and that's called hylozoism. Okay, so both of these views, panpsychism and hylozoism, both of them are terms that are very much in currency in the philosophy and public discourse in the late 19th century, are both about, in some way, that mind and matter are mixed. Okay? Now, hylozoism has a very distinctive kind of way of looking at this, which panpsychism, I would argue, is the opposite of. Okay? Now, this was perhaps not so clear in the late 19th century, though actually, if you look at the people who identified with the two terms, they tended to move in different circles. But it seems to me the conflict becomes much more apparent now because of the role materialism as an ideology plays. Hylozoism is essentially a materialist ideology, essentially a naturalist ideology. It's the idea that mind emerges from matter. Mind emerges, so in other words, matter is there in the beginning. Not mind, matter. And then it's going to be certain properties of matter. So for example, self-organizational capacities, right? The capacity to put boundaries around itself and determine goals, right? All this kind of stuff that, we would normally call the more teleological aspects of matter that we can see in the cell, as Georg was presenting last night, right? This kind of thing, right? And this then gets scaled up over time. Hylozoism. And it's on that basis that you could start to say that material things have a certain kind of mind dependent on the kind of matter they are. Right? Now that kind of view very nicely fits into Aristotle, for example, right? So Aristotle, as you know, those of you, especially more scholastically oriented people, right? We have this idea of vegetative soul. Even plants have minds, right? Everything's got a mind. I mean, it's got a mind that's appropriate to its material constitution. And what the mind is the organizational principle behind the material constitution. Hylozoism is about that. And it's about how, again, Hylozoism is very much influenced by evolutionary thinking. So you've got the small things, they combine to make the big things, and so complexity is very much part of what Hylozoism. If you want to talk about where the dynamic of Hylozoism is about complexification. So I would say, for example, the first man to really put forward a serious theory of evolution, Lamarque, he fits into this category. Okay? And then complexification is, in a way, a kind of indirect material measure of mentality. Okay? And so when we talk about stuff like the human brain, at the end of the road, as it were, we talk about the number of neurons and how many connections they have amongst themselves and stuff like that. Right? And then we say, this is the most mental thing going on, the brain. Right? But the point I want to make about Hylozoism, right, is that Hylozoism is driven on the material thing. Right? It's about matter driving the process. Right? And it's emergent. And then the question is, how does this emergence actually occur? Right? And this has always been the source of dispute and stuff like this. And Darwinism, strictly speaking, Darwinism as a theory of evolution is kind of a bit agnostic on this point. There is no reason, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, that the beings of the future are going to be more complex in the sense I've just been talking about than the ones in the past. There's no reason to think that at all, actually. And if the Anthropocene happens, and we're obliterated by a global climate catastrophe, that will vindicate Darwinism and refute Hylozoism. Okay? Get it straight. Nevertheless, the people who have believed in Hylozoism in the late 19th century were guys like Ernst Haeckel, who was a Darwinist. But he wasn't too careful about what he exactly was endorsing from this standpoint. Okay? But he was someone who was promoting Hylozoism and basically saying that this is how we should be measuring progress and how we should be doing our policy. And in this respect, he functioned very much like a Richard Dawkins figure. And by the way, for those of you who follow Richard Dawkins carefully, and maybe you shouldn't, the point is that this is a man, Richard Dawkins, who, despite what we know actually about how Darwinian evolution works, nevertheless thinks that this is a view that in the long term benefits complexity. So he actually holds something that looks like a kind of Hylozoist view, but from Darwin's standpoint, there's no reason to think that. If the environment changes radically, very complex beings can just disappear because they get over-adapted to the niches in which their complexity has been constructed. Okay? So, that's Hylozoism. Panpsychism starts from the other direction. Okay? And here I think, in order to understand where panpsychism is coming from, one needs to understand German idealism. And I know that'll lead to groans from people, but and the idea here is German idealism. So this is a post-Kantian movement that if you look at all of these figures, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, one of the things they had in common was they weren't going to accept Kant as the final word. They were very dissatisfied. I was mentioning earlier about Kant having this kind of separate but equal metaphysical view. Well, they weren't going to have it. They weren't going to have it, right? And this is the early 19th century. This is not the late 19th, the early 19th century when this begins. And so they had various ways of figuring this stuff out, but the one that I think was most relevant, and the German idealist who is of most relevance to the discussion of panpsychism is Schelling. And the key doctrine of Schelling that's important here is the idea, if I may put it in a nutshell, that that nature is basically a kind of undisclosed mind, and mind is fully disclosed nature. So it's a kind of identity metaphysics, right, where nature is seen as a kind of potential for something else that needs to be realized. Okay? And that, in a sense, this is what science is about, and this is what always theology was about. And by the way, I think it's fair to say with all these German idealists that when they're doing their metaphysics, the kind of theology they're definitely thinking about is Christian theology. Okay? And I could say more about this if people want to bring this up in the question about the role of Christian theology as driving this, because nowadays panpsychism has all these associations with Buddhism and Eastern philosophy and all the rest of it. But the point is, I think what's interesting from the standpoint of how this philosophy got developed in the first place, right, it was through a certain kind of radical reading of Christian eschatology. Right? That's kind of how this kind of thing got off the ground, right? And here, of course, and this is what makes Christianity, again, I don't want to go too much into this, but what makes Christianity quite distinctive as a religion within the Abrahamic tradition, especially separated from Judaism and Islam, is the person of Jesus and about what he was all about from a metaphysical standpoint. Okay? Because Jesus is supposedly, and this is what makes Christianity quite unique, the fixation on Jesus, right, is a material being who in some sense has divinity in them. Right? Very concrete case, right? And where the efficacy is there simultaneously. Right? This is the thing about Jesus that makes him very different from, Moses or Muhammad, right? In other words, very distinctive. And I think with these German idealists, right, who in a sense are already living under the shadow of critical historical theology, if you're familiar with that kind of movement within Protestantism in the late 18th century, right? There's this, it's very important in terms of demystifying the Bible, right? Trying to figure out what were those miracles really doing from a kind of empirical standpoint, right? Critical historical theology, you may have heard of this. If not, you should. Protestantism became very liberal in the 19th century through critical historical theology, and you can look at guys like Marx as having been very influenced by it. I mean, I don't want to go into all that, but the point about this whole general line of thinking was it was already there with the German idealists, and so they're trying to figure out, okay, the Bible in some way isn't going to be really sufficient. Faith isn't really going to be sufficient, and so the question then becomes, we actually need to rationalize this in some way. We need some kind of metaphysical understanding of what's going on. We need a kind of, more intellectually sophisticated version of what's going on. And I would see German idealism as very much participating in that kind of project, okay? So I'm going to move away from Jesus now. We can talk about the Bible and the rest of it afterwards, but the point is that this is kind of, I would say, is in the background as a kind of motivating factor with regard to getting these guys thinking, how is it possible, right, how do you relate matter and mind in a way that you can start with the assumption that mind is fundamental because mind being associated in this argument with God, right? So God, in a way, is fundamental. Nevertheless, God, as it were, isn't really being manifested in the world fully. So the fallen status of humanity, the fallen status of the world generally, this is the context, I would say, in which the idea of nature, right, as being undisclosed or unrevealed mind in Schelling should be understood. Right? That in a sense the world begins in a fallen state, and the fallen state is called nature. And then the question is, how does it get out of that? How does it get out of that? Right? And in that sense, revealing more and more mentality over time. Okay? And that's kind of the general picture of panpsychism that I would like to argue for you, right? Right, in a sense, that's where panpsychism is coming from. So in a sense, it's starting from the opposite place from hylozoism, right? And so it's kind of taking a lot of the biblical stuff pretty seriously in a way, and then trying to say, well, nevertheless, though, there seems to be progress, there seems to be humanity, there seems to be all this other stuff going on. What's happening? Okay? Now, when we move beyond German idealism, which is, largely conducted in a metaphysical vein, if you know anything about these guys like Fichte, Schelling, or Hegel, right? These guys are metaphysicians, they're doing the usual metaphysical stuff, right? It doesn't really have all that much scientific traction in their own terms, but nevertheless, they influence a lot of people who then go on to do empirical science. This is the point I want to raise. And to a certain extent, I think the history, both the history of science and especially the history of philosophy, has been very much negligent or biased against recognizing this fact. Right? The extent to which this kind of German idealism actually has influenced a lot about the way in which empirical science has taken place. And this is not just true, so the main man behind this panpsychism in the late 19th century, Gustav Fechner, who was a student of Schelling, right? Not just him, but of course a lot of the ways in which people thought about biology and lots of other different disciplines that were rising in the late 19th century owe a lot to German idealism, okay? So that's a very important point. And one of the things that Fechner, so if you study Gustav Fechner today, okay, he thought of himself very much kind of in the spirit of Leibniz, as this kind of pan-sophist, right? This philosopher who knew everything, panlogist, whatever you want to call it, right? Someone who was about everything. But of course, what he's remembered for now is being one of the founders of experimental psychology, and especially the branch of experimental psychology that's known as psychophysics. Now, psychophysics is basically about the way it's done now, right? And this is where all the metaphysics kind of drops out, and then you see what he's talking about instrumentally, right, is the degree to which shifting a stimulus shifts the response. Right? So, you raise the level of some auditory stimulus, and then does the person see it as different, louder, softer, or not? That's psychophysics. And you can do this for all the senses, you can do it for everything. And to a large extent, that kind of paradigm of doing research actually drove the history of psychology in the 20th century, because you can easily get something like behaviorism on the back of that. It's correlating stimulus and response for everything, not just sensation. Okay? Fechner's responsible for that. He didn't think about it in such instrumental terms, though. He thought of it as metaphysical. Namely, he was looking at the point at which differences in matter mattered to mind. Right? In other words, at what point does a change in something physical gives you a change in something mental? And he came up with this log equation, which meant that you had to, you have to actually boost the stimulus more to get a comparable response. So in other words, it's not like a direct correlation, right? It's not like matter and mind are, just parallel ways of talking about the same thing. There's some kind of complex relation going on, okay? Now, this idea is in psychology known as the just noticeable difference, right? At what point does a change in a stimulus cause a change in the response? And this is an empirically decidable thing, okay? But what it led people to do, and this was a very important kind of feature of what happened in the late 19th century, which I think really facilitated kind of what panpsychism was going for, was that it started to say, well, look, if we're actually trying to get a stronger response from people, we actually want them to, as it were, think harder, do something more, then are there more efficient ways of getting them to do it than the normal means? So it became a kind of signal, a kind of indicator of efficiency, and made people wonder whether human senses, for example, which is the thing that Fechner primarily studied, were really sufficient in their own right as a material basis to get human beings to fully realize their mental powers. Okay? And so on the back of a lot of this stuff in the late 19th century, we start seeing things that we associate nowadays. Again, this is where philosophy kind of destroys its own history. What we call the philosophy of technology. Okay? And the idea, which you may know from Marshall McLuhan, right, that technology as the extension of the senses. Okay? And so there's this guy called Ernst Kapp, German, who lived in the United States in the late 19th century, who is usually seen as having, he wrote a book with the title Philosophy of Technology in the late 1877, I think, who is already putting forward this view in a very direct kind of way. Namely, the idea that part of what our minds can do, right, because obviously by the time we get to the late 19th century, people already know that one of the things that's distinctive about human beings as creatures, even as material creatures, is we create these technologies that enable us to extend our control over things. The Industrial Revolution already was getting into full flow there, right? People knew this stuff, okay? And so the question might then, the question then arises, well, this is not just about improving material well-being, but in some sense enabling us to live more efficiently in the world so that we can actually do more, and we can actually reveal more about our hidden mental powers, okay? This kind of idea is being promoted by Ernst Kapp in the late 19th century. Another person in France who has a kind of similar angle on this is Alfred Espinat. Okay? He's the man who writes the first PhD in sociology, again around the same period in the 1870s. And he is thinking about, so he's not thinking about, let's say, the way in which, telegraph extends humans' abilities to communicate with each other, which is kind of what Ernst Kapp is very fascinated by, right? The telegraph comes on stream in the 1840s, right? And so there's a sense in which, wow, the world gets globalized all of a sudden, right? This telegraph does this for you already. Forget about the internet, right? The telegraph is doing this. And he's saying, wow, this is in some sense, what is this technology doing? It's not just material in the sense of, improving our lives in some material limited kind of way, but it's actually transforming the way in which we can, in fact, relate to the world. It's performing a kind of metaphysical function, right? And this is what the philosophy of technology was about. And so there's a sense in which part of what human beings can do as they're working over matter is, in a sense, to spiritualize themselves this way, where spiritualization is associated now with having the global reach, the reach of God, right? Where we, in some sense, we can control things, we can kind of permeate in much wider spaces than we ever could before, okay? And, and Espinat, actually, what he adds to this discussion, and again, I don't know how many, for some of the younger people in the audience who follow French epistemology, Georges Canguilhem, Foucault, I don't know. Does anyone follow that stuff here? No, not really. Some do. Okay. Well, the point is, he's talked, if you follow the footnotes for these kinds of guys, you'll find it, okay? Espinat was a translator of Herbert Spencer into French, he started coming up with this idea of thinking about ant colonies and all of these kind of social insects kind of creatures as, in a sense, technologists. Right? Technologists who, in some sense, through mutual incorporation, actually raise themselves to a higher species level and create a kind of level of spirituality in that sense. And he was thinking about this as kind of a model for how we should think about the human condition and where humanity was going. Okay? Now, you see all of this stuff, right? This is the kind of... So what we're talking about here is not... We're talking about the material condition as, in a way, a kind of liability at the outset, but that one actually reworks it, unworks it, outworks it, in order to produce something that, in fact, extends the original power of the beings involved. In that sense, spiritualizes them. The outworking is the spiritualization. Okay? And it seems to me that this is the sense of panpsychism that, in a way, starts to lead us much more in the direction of something like transhumanism and these things that were raised in the beginning about what I've been working on here. And I want to say a little bit about this because one of the problems with having a high... So let me just return to hylozoism from... How much more time do I have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Because I think hylozoism, where you start with matter, and somehow through the complexification of matter you get mind, I think that's kind of the more normal way for people who want to go down this kind of route, this neutral monism route, to go down. I think one of the problems it faces, especially if it gets into very serious biological country, is the fact that it doesn't really work out very neatly from a biological standpoint. Okay, this is where we need to have a think about what exactly, when we talk about the human being, what we mean. Because if you think about Homo sapiens as the biological species, so forget about any discussion of the soul and everything, but just look at Homo sapiens as some emergent phenomena from some hylozoist process, whether Darwinian or not, right, where we just emerge from other species over time. One of the things that's very distinctive about Homo sapiens is, yeah, we got this big brain, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that while we're morphologically different, like we have a bigger brain than the other creatures, our powers are not necessarily better than the other creatures, right? So in other words, hylozoism doesn't give you, there's no absolute sense from any biological standpoint in which human beings are superior to other animals, right? If you're just looking at it from a material standpoint, other animals are in fact superior to us in almost every other kind of dimension. In fact, this is one of the arguments that can be used for animal rights as being put on a level of human rights if you're operating from a purely materialist, hylozoist viewpoint. Right? We have a bigger brain, but we have yet to see what this bigger brain is actually giving us, because it might give us the end of the world, right? Especially if you believe in the Anthropocene. Right? Again, I'm thinking about this from a purely materialist standpoint, from a purely naturalistic standpoint, from a standpoint that doesn't presuppose mind. What does this look like? Okay? And so, of course, there are debates. I mean, when you look at the way in which the various species in biology are classified, there are debates among people who want to take the morphology seriously versus those who want to take genetics seriously or whatever, right? And one of the things that we're learning more and more as we study genetics is, in fact, other creatures have various interesting things about their genes that if we were to put them in our genes would give us powers we never had before. Okay? Now, why do we even go down that route? Well, it's because there's some sense in which whatever this emergence picture, this kind of complexification picture, hylozoist picture, whatever that's supposed to turn out to be, isn't going to give you a neat picture with human beings coming up on top. It isn't. It really isn't. Okay? The closest you can do is the brain. And then there's a question about what the value of the brain is from the standpoint of materialism and naturalism. Okay? So you're not going to really be able to kind of get the kind of story you want about human beings from this kind of story, it seems to be. You really aren't, unless you're talking, you have to bring something else in there. Okay? And so panpsychism has the virtue of starting from the opposite direction, right? Where namely, there's a sense in which nature at the beginning, right, is in the most mentally opaque state. Right, where the mind has yet to be fully realized. And then, over time, it develops in a way in which mentality is more realized. And of course, that then leads to the instrumentalization of matter, which then creates the kind of world in which more mental powers can be realized. And this is what we would call human progress normally. And this is where the history of technology then becomes more of the driving force of what makes human beings human. Okay? It seems to me that this actually this comports better with the actual way in which the history of science and technology has developed. The question is, though, what exactly does this mean from a normative and moral standpoint? Because it seems to me The end of the panpsychist picture is to have mind fully realized. You have a fully realized universe. A universe that's completely lit up, as it were. That's kind of what the vision is, it seems to me. If you imagine this as something happening over time. And of course there have been many different kind of versions of this way of presenting it. Okay? And I would just, put one on the table here before closing, and this connects us to transhumanism. And this is kind of idea that was very much popular in the 20th century in Russia, called cosmism. Right? And this is the kind of idea, this is the kind of ideology that began from a very sort of heretical range of the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia, but then got adopted and secularized and repackaged with the Soviet period, and became kind of the ideology that motivated the space race as a means by which you determine human superiority. The first to conquer space wins, right? And this became very much a kind of dynamic in the Cold War. Again, you have to ask, where did this come from exactly, right? It comes from this kind of panpsychism where there's a sense in which the unfolding of the mind through matter eventually leads to the mind, the mind populating the universe. And this is where space travel comes in. Okay? It's part of that kind of picture. And so one of the major, Tsiolkovsky, who is one of the major Russian cosmists in the early 20th century, 1920s, 30s, who actually theorizes about the possibility of space travel and actually manages to, you might say, transition from the pre-Soviet to the Soviet period, so he's still regarded very well. There are museums to him in Moscow, all the rest of it. He talks about the Earth as the cradle of humanity. The cradle, right? We got to get out of there, right? In order to fully realize ourselves, we have to be everywhere, okay? And he's imagining that over the course of this, and this was very much part of the Soviet ideology as well, humanity will radically transform itself. It might merge with machines, it might do all kinds of stuff. In other words, there's a sense in which the biological past is the past. It's not the future. The future is out there. The future is somewhere else. The future is the whole universe, okay? Now, it seems to me that this is a panpsychist viewpoint with regard to how you think about what human beings are. Because remember, when I began this talk, I said to you that my concern, my interest in panpsychism was, how does it actually relate to a kind of understanding of the human condition? Okay, because it's one thing to talk about it in the abstract, but the question is, what does it mean for humanity? And I think it is one of those kinds of views where it sees nature as unrevealed mind, right? And mind as fully realized nature, right? As a view that pushes humanity to constantly engage in a process of physical self-transformation to realize all of the powers that are potentially available to it. Okay? And this is what I think panpsychism ultimately drives one toward. And it's had, I think, actually quite a lot of influence, especially if you think of the future of humanity. See, because I think one of the problems that we have when we tell the narrative of humanity is we're too fixated on Homo sapiens. We're too fixated on the upright ape, right? And in some sense, where we came from determines where we're going to go, right? There's a sense in which we're really kind of fixated. Even a lot of the people who are futuristic talk this way. So I'm just good. I'll stop at that, but you may know Yuval Harari. Are you familiar with him? Yuval Harari, best-selling author from the New York Times, right? He wrote a book called Sapiens, right? And then he's got a more recent book called Homo Deus, right? And he's very critical of what you might say the kind of view I'm proposing here, because he really believes at the end of the day these are illusions, right? That human beings are apes, upright apes, and the fact that we have these big brains is just leading us to hallucinate all these kinds of possibilities, like going off to space and colonizing and all the rest of it. And this is a kind of metaphysics that's going to lead to our downfall. He seems to be reasonably convinced of that, unless we change our ways, right? That there's some sense in which he regards this kind of panpsychist position that I'm presenting as actually quite dangerous from the material physical standpoint of human beings, okay? And of course, the issues about climate change and so forth speak well in his favor, you might say. But I would put this on the table because this is kind of the view that panpsychism is opposed to. It's opposed to the idea of fixating on the human with regard to Homo sapiens. Because Homo sapiens, remember, is a mid-18th century coinage. The notion of humanity existed well before the 18th century. In fact, it's very much rooted right in theological culture and in Greek and Roman culture, and it has a quite independent meaning. And so from the standpoint of being concerned about the human, one should always keep an open mind about the exact form of material embodiment it takes. Okay? And that there's no reason to be fixated on the upright ape. And I think, there's no, this is one lesson I would say a panpsychist would say with regard to humanity. Namely, you don't just fixate on this particular history that we've come from, but rather think about what are the powers that we have within us that could be explored in a variety of different ways, by different means, and that we've already begun to do. Okay? So I will stop here and take questions. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your indulgence.
So where do you put Velikovsky
Oh, Velikovsky.
in this scheme? Because what you've outlined assumes an evolutionary point of view.
Yes, of a sort.
Velikovsky is a catastrophist.
Yeah.
And does that have any cogency here?
Well,
I mean, if Harari is right, and the human is, what shall we say, transformed, that's in a sense the end of the Anthropocene.
well, see, this is the thing. I mean, one of the things that I think people... Look, I mean, okay, so within the transhumanist community, for example, there are a lot of kind of somewhat crazy proposals about how we might get around the Anthropocene and global warming. So the point is, you don't deny that global warming's happening and that it potentially poses a major catastrophe for the planet. But there are a lot of ways out of it, according to transhumanists, who I think, in a way, is thinking in a very panpsychist way. Namely that, first of all, you might actually alter the physical makeup of humans, make them smaller, make them consume less resources through genetic modification, right, as a way of being able to realize everything that's valuable about being a human being without necessarily having the kind of evolutionary form that human beings have had up to this point. Okay? This seems to be very much in the spirit of panpsychism, because there's a sense in which the mentality, right, the spirituality, is not dependent on having a particular form of matter, that in some sense the matter could be optimized to actually enable the spiritual mental form to be realized, perhaps even more efficiently than it has done already. Okay? So that's one thing. And of course, taking off to other planets is another one. They talk about that a lot too. But the point is that transhumanists are open to the idea that the physical being of the human could be radically modified in order to adjust to these issues. So the issue would not be necessarily to control the climate so it remains at the same temperature to enable people to live the lives they lead now, but rather to assume that there will be these changes, and then we're going to make ourselves into the beings that can live well under those circumstances. That's kind of more in the spirit of what we're talking about here. Now you might say, oh, this is bonkers, right? At least if you don't give us enough time. But the point is that this is kind of the spirit in which what I'm talking about here is, right? So in some sense, the fact that we come from upright apes and we've kind of developed this way, and you can show certain kinds of, lineages and continuities, that's nice, that's important. You need to know that, but that doesn't determine the future. There must be some other things. Oh, sorry, okay.
First, thank you for an amazing historical journey through mind and matter. That was great. So many questions come to mind, but something you were just touching on there in concluding. There is a sense that you say it doesn't have to be stuck with Homo sapiens, right? We can change matter. But I also thought I heard you in the back, I'd like to clarify that mind isn't finished, that we might be using matter to actually help mind.
Yes, that's the point. Yes, that's where the technology stuff becomes very important. Because the technology provides a kind of scaffolding, you might say, to enable us to get to the next level. Right? I mean, I do think that, in fact, that's kind of the spirit in which I would say Espinal, who I mentioned earlier, right, was talking about the ant colonies. The ant colonies, in some sense, bootstrapped the ants into doing something more than they could do if they were just individuals. Right? And so he's using this as kind of the, you might say, the biological model for infrastructure. Yeah.
And so it's not just that we're spreading mind out, but that we're continuing something that's been happening all along.
Oh, yes, of course.
Through us.
That's right, of course. But I do think the interesting thing about starting from the mind side rather than the matter side is that in some sense, matter starts off by being seen as a liability that has to be overcome. So in other words, you don't accept matter as it is. You don't accept your material condition as it is. You see this as somehow indicative of being, in some sense, a fallen state, and you have to overcome it, but the way you overcome it is through working through the matter.
But matter also changes mind.
Yeah, oh, of course.
There's a dynamism here.
Well, there is, except I would say, if you're a panpsychist, okay? So let's stick to the purist position on this. The panpsychist would say that what is happening when we're working through the matter and we create this technological scaffolding that enables us to do new things that we couldn't do before is that we're realizing the hidden potential, right? It's about realizing the hidden potential. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I just listened.
Oh, there you are, sorry.
I wanted to just, actually my question zips off of that one a little bit. The idea of realizing has two different contexts to me. One is realizing, in other words, making something happen or obtaining something that is a potential, so we realize our fullest potential, which in somehow is connected to mind.
Yes.
Mind.
Mm-hmm.
I see that as potentially and probably historically problematic in that seems to be a power play.
It is, yes.
Right?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
The other way of looking at realizing, which comes from Elia's work, I think, is seeing what is already there. In other words, if mind permeates the universe, then there is unitive connection already. And so as one of the things that I think about technology, getting back to the idea of I think Cap and the telegraph, is when I think of cell phones now and the fact that I can communicate with anybody anywhere, it feels like I'm moving towards an ability to imagine a unitive consciousness to which I could be a part.
Yes.
So it's moving almost like towards a telepathic. So when I think of a Christian unity in God, I think that imagines me being able to think of myself and think of the universe in a way where some boundaries are coming down, and I'm able to participate in the unity of all things in a way that would have freaked out previous generations of some cultures, although I'm not sure they would have freaked out other cultures. I think other cultures might have imagined that we were part of a whole, and that I would see that as permeating mind as well. So it's interesting. I see this in the idea of realizing mind that it could go in one of two directions, and I just wondered if you would comment on that.
Well, look, so in my mind, at least, I don't see these two options as so distinct, and the point that I would put to you, you don't have, obviously you don't want to respond, but the point I would put to you is that what motivates people, let's say, to develop the telegraph and develop the smartphone, right? Because there's a sense in which, and this is where I kind of recoil a bit from a more passive understanding of realization, which is the second one you presented. I do think there has to be a power play involved, insofar as you have to feel like you have to be motivated to actually develop the telegraph, right? Because we could live in a world that doesn't require it. And people could feel unity without it, right? I mean, we've got mystics, we've got all these kinds of people out there who are pre-telegraph, right? And pre-smartphone and all the rest of it. And they can feel all this unity you're talking about already in a sense, but this is not quite what we're talking about here. We're talking about a sense, this is where the fallen state is. And we can go back to Christianity and talk about this a little bit. But the fallen status that one in some sense has to recover from, which then forces one then to create all this stuff that enables us to have this greater consciousness, this greater unity and stuff like that. I think that's a very important point here. Right? And if you just have the view that, you can experience all this unity and so forth, you don't actually require that technology in the very basic level to do that. And here we're talking about something a bit different.
But if we're thinking, sorry, I should have stayed at the mic.
Go ahead, go for it. We got time. Go ahead.
I think it might also go back to the purpose, though, of unity. In other words, I see it as not just being aware that we're all part of the same thing. I see it as actually being able to co-create. And so I think, I don't know if you're aware of Robin Collins' work on the discoverability. He works in philosophy of science. But what I think about that, the fact that we want to discover, and that all the discoverability, the things that we create, the things that we find, our technology, gives us an awareness of what it would be like to collaborate, what it would be like to co-create on a larger level, what it would be like to be in community. So I can get a sense as a mystic that I'm part of something, but the mystical language is very vague. It's something you can't talk about. It's not something you can really do something about. In a sense of interiority, I was talking about this over breakfast. But if there's a sense that we can do something, especially on a spiritual, cosmic level that brings us towards creating a more just and verdant universe, then I think those two come, then I think there's a reason that's where the two come. In other words, understanding our potential, realizing our ability to change the world and the cosmos together, and realizing that we are already together united, and connecting somehow into that, into some sort of like creative visualization where we use the language, where we use the metaphors, we use the symbols that our technology allows us to even think thoughts that I couldn't have thought before. I could have had a vague sense as maybe an Aboriginal person that I'm part of something grand. But to think about changing the world in using visualizations or knowledge that we've come up through the theology. Anyhow, I think that's where, to me, that's the excitement of where we're moving all together in this realization of both of our potential and our unity, and that's very hopeful.
No, look, I kind of share this kind of hope. I do think, though, there is, you might say from the standpoint of history, there is a realpolitik aspect of this about how we actually get there and what kinds of self-transformations and transformations of others are going to be required in order to actually fully realize this kind of sense of unity. And you know, when one talks about that, then it might not look so rosy in a certain sense, right? Because we're going to be leaving stuff behind, right? And I think, you know, and this is, but the point is I do share the general positive vision that you're talking about. And in a sense, what I'm talking about more here is about how you would actually get there, how you get, you know, what would you be doing, you know, how, and what would be the evidence for that, right? I mean, and I think we do need to kind of address that point. But thank you very much for your comment. So who's next? You?
Relative to the cell phone, I was at a talk recently where a woman from the MIT Media Lab gave a presentation kind of looking at the brain-computer interface and how transparent it's going to become. But nonetheless, she spent the first 10 minutes of her talk apologizing for what the cell phone has done to your children.
Yeah.
So there's a potential, you know, the potential on one side and the downside is there too.
Yeah, but see, okay, well that issue, it seems to me that this kind of issue, because I'm old enough to remember television, okay? And people were saying exactly the same kind of stuff. It'll destroy your attention span, it'll do all this kind of stuff. This is back in the 1960s when I was a kid. And you know, we've gone through that. Now you might say, oh my God, we shouldn't have gone through television in the first place. We shouldn't have gone through the telephone, because that meant that we didn't have to deal with each other in person so much. right? The telegraph, my God, that vulgarized, the exoticism of distance, right? I mean, you could go on and on back in history if you want to play that game. No, I think to a large extent, I'm not denying that there are going to be specific pathologies that are generated by technologies, but I think for the most part, this is part of our coming to realize that certain aspects of the world that we had taken for granted from a material standpoint aren't necessary and we can move on elsewhere. So, for example, with the shortened attention spans and the fact that people can't process words the way they used to and they're processing them differently, actually give rise to new kinds of communication that to a large extent actually enable more people to participate. So as a kind of worse form of English becomes more generally acceptable, more of the world can communicate with us. So I mean, this is kind of the spirit in which I operate here. Yes, I guess you're next. We're going to, is this the protocol? We go back and forth? Yes, good.
So I actually have a question about the combination problem. How is it that little conscious subject of experience can come to form big conscious experiences? Oh, can you not hear me? Okay, I'll repeat my question.
Oh, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Well, I was explaining that I have a question about the combination problem and how is it that little conscious subjects of experience can come to form larger, bigger conscious subjects of experience? And you mentioned things like unity and God.
No. Actually, I don't start from that standpoint. That is much more like a hylozoist standpoint. Okay, I start from the standpoint that mind's already there, it's just not fully realized. And then, as it were, you have the first inklings, the first bursts of it, and then and the mind becomes more fully realized. So it's a different picture, because what you're talking about with little consciousnesses sounds very much like a kind of materialist, atomistic picture that somehow through combination you end up getting these more complex things. And panpsychism, I don't think, is actually committed to that.
Okay.
Right, but hylozoism is, and I think that is a kind of interesting problem for hylozoism. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's a difference between whether you start from the material side or the mental side. And let me just make a point about this, because in a sense, I don't know. So yesterday we were having this discussion. Where is Philip Clayton? Are you here somewhere? There you go. Okay, so I asked a question. I don't know if you were here yesterday, but I asked a question to Philip Clayton about the boundary of interiority. Okay, so in other words, where is the space in which whatever the mind, the mentality is playing out? And this seems to be very naturalistically defined, right? That there's this initial space where consciousness happens and then the consciousnesses maybe interact or something like that. I don't think this is quite what the panpsychist picture is. The panpsychist picture is different. It's sort of more in the sense that everything already has mind, but it's just in a kind of dumb sleeping state. And then it gradually awakens. And in fact, Schelling and people like that talk this way, right? That there's a gradual awakening, right, of the mind from matter. And so that's a different kind of model for how you go about talking about mind. In which case, then, that self-differentiation has to be part of the awakening. I hope that doesn't sound too metaphysical. The point is that the idea is as mind becomes more alert, it then divides amongst itself. So there's no natural division. There's no little consciousnesses well-bounded, etc., etc. That's not how it begins. It begins in a kind of undifferentiated state, which becomes more differentiated over time. And that's one reason why I don't fixate on the idea of human being as Homo sapiens. Because in some sense, we might actually end up becoming part of larger systems in a much more extended sense and so forth. Okay, and the mind allows for that kind of possibility, right? That we might turn into a world soul, as it were. I keep that kind of option open, actually.
Okay, and where would you say Leibniz falls?
Oh, see, Leibniz, there you go. You don't know exactly. Thank you. No, because I was wondering whether I should talk about Leibniz, but you're right. Leibniz is where this whole mess begins. In a sense, he is... Yeah, because he has this idea of monadology, which kind of suggests that you might be able to build up consciousnesses, but in fact he doesn't think of monadology in that kind of evolutionary way. But no, I would say, I mean, I was talking to Georg about this last night when we were coming back to the hotel, that I think Leibniz is kind of the proto-panpsychist, right? So in a sense, this is where, if you want to get your imagination moving in that direction, he would be the guy to go to, because he definitely has this kind of idea of matter as being very opaque mind, right? And Schelling is influenced by Leibniz in this respect, even though he doesn't adopt the kind of monadological metaphysics. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Glad you raised it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Hello. Hi. Thank you for your talk. So I really like this idea of, is this working?
Yeah, it's working for me.
Yeah, so I like this idea that mind is prior, right, and that matter, or the world is fallen, and we're supposed to, mind is supposed to populate it in this sense. And I really like this idea that we're supposed to uncover these hidden potentials, right? But what I do worry about, and what I would like to see your kind of sketch for, is how we can distinguish between those good potentials and those bad potentials, right? So I mean, like we were just talking about the cell phone. You said, oh, we've lost this ability for to appreciate exotic distances or something like that. Potential we've lost, but and I guess what's your principal path forward for? I know it's a big question, but I think it's the important question.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm a bit kind of uncertain about this, because if you're someone, let me put it this way. I have a lot of sympathy for Hegel at times like this, because I think if you believe in a kind of radical futurity, as it were, that namely the future kind of determines what in fact was good and bad about the past, right? So there's always a kind of retrospective evaluation taking place. I don't think we can actually ever say that, but there's a sense in which one starts from where one is, to a certain extent. One of the things that makes me self-identify as, let's say, a progressive thinker, right, is that I believe that there is unrealized potential out there, and that realizing that might be worth getting rid of stuff that we've had for a while, because that stuff that we had in the past worked for us then, but may not be working for us now or in the future. Okay? And I think insofar as you think we have some kind of time on our hands, that this is kind of the way to look at it. I don't think we can make really a priori radical, positive, negative moral judgments in that sense. This is not to say you can't make, immediate ones, local ones, and so forth, but I think if we're talking about this in the large metaphysical level, I think this is always potentially open and revisable, actually.
Sure. Can I just add one more thing? So I probably shouldn't have used good and bad. This is more of a metaphysical question, because if you have an idea of what the mind is and what these realized potentials are, then like what you're saying is, this picture you have of filling up the universe, this isn't a moral one. This is a metaphysical one, right? Things are just like getting more light,
Yes, it's that kind of image, yes.
Right. So I guess I don't know if this would change your answer, but I think it's less about an a priori moral stance and more what's your understanding of what the perfect mind is and what the perfect powers are,
Well, God. I mean, look, come on. Look, at the end of the day, we're talking about God, and this is why, in a sense, again, if we wanted to be very explicit about theology and why we're starting with a fallen state in the first place, right? This is where interesting issues about Christianity and the Christian conception of God, and here you might say, I'm one of these guys, for example, who is quite sympathetic to the ontological argument for the existence of God, right? So I do think that there's this kind of conceptual horizon that in a way we're always pushing toward and we can already imagine. And in a sense, that provides a kind of regulative ideal for the kind of thing I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm kind of open to all that stuff. Thank you. I hope that'll do at least for the time being. Yeah.
So first, thank you for your talk. I think this historical narrative really enriches the history of the mind-body problem that you usually encounter in like a philosophy class, and so I really enjoyed that. My question is about hylozoism.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to me that there were two claims. There's a metaphysical claim that mind emerges from matter.
That's right.
There's like a normative or teleological claim that greater complexity is better. Or
Yeah,
or
exactly.
aiming at-
That's the modern notion. Yeah, Aristotle doesn't really have that, I don't think, but the modern notion of hylozoism does. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if there's room for like a third position that takes the metaphysical claim without the normative claim, so that mind emerges from greater complexity, but that there's nothing that's aiming at that complexity, or that it's not better to be more complex. So I have in mind, like, I don't know if you are familiar with work by Evan Thompson and Francisco Varela on the emergence of mind from life, and I believe you brought this up yesterday. So how does that sort of position fare in comparison to panpsychism?
Well, I would say it's starting from a different place. Let's put it that way. It's, I would consider a very sophisticated version of hylozoism, actually, rather than because I don't think panpsychism is really committed to notions of complexity per se. You know, in other words, the way in which complexity gets used as kind of a metric. I don't think panpsychism is necessarily. I mean, it's a different kind of way of thinking about things, I would say. But again, I mean, I would want to study. I haven't thought about Varela's work in particular in terms of hylozoism very much, or panpsychism. So I think about it in a different context. But the point is that would be my first response.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm just thinking if the argument for panpsychism relies on showing that this normative claim is false, then you might say, okay, let's give up the normative claim, but keep the metaphysical claim of the hylozoists. And so if that's a live position, then...
Well, which would be the claim that you'd want to keep alive?
That mind emerges from greater complexity, but not that there's anything superior about greater complexity.
No, but that's a very, okay. I mean, okay. But why do you want to do it? What would be the motivation for doing that?
I guess it's, the motivation is a different starting point.
No, I understand. So you don't like the idea of starting with the idea of a kind of unawakened mind. You don't like that idea.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I was trained as an analytic philosopher, so my starting point is...
Well, look, but being an analytic philosopher doesn't mean you have to be a kind of robust materialist.
Totally. But
right?
I mean, in terms of arguing for panpsychism, putting forward the argument, it seems like that's the position that needs to be taken down. The metaphysical claim, taking down the normative claim, only gets you part of the way.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, look, if we're just talking about... See, analytic philosophy already entertains quite a lot of a priorism generally, okay? A lot of things that seem to be very mind-driven, concept-driven, etc., as being constitutive of reality. And so insofar as analytic philosophy is willing to accept that kind of stuff, then I don't think panpsychism is out of the question, actually. Right? I mean, so that's kind of what I would say, but analytic philosophy seems to be quite metaphysically neutral in this regard.
Yeah, so maybe it's really a burden-shifting argument?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't mind having both positions develop themselves. We'll go... Okay, thank you. Yeah. Just move to the next... Well, because we're going to go back and forth. Is that okay? Yes.
Hi, thank you. And this question is related to two that were already asked before, so maybe you'll just be re-explaining yourself for us. But in terms of...
Give me a little hope here.
So you barely used the term emergence at all in your talk.
I'm not crazy about it.
Okay. So it seems like you're pairing hylozoism with classical conceptions of emergence and saying panpsychism is different from that, you prefer panpsychism, but your account of mind gradually emerging from matter seems like it could use emergentist tropes. I mean, there has to be some sort of arrangement that then allows this thing to happen, right? Some combination, some arrangement. Even in the
combination, see, the thing is this combination notion
of parts. I don't know. It doesn't.
No, well, okay, but one needs to be very clear about this, because it does seem to me that emergence position, I mean, as it was even presented yesterday, right? It does say, you know, you start with the simple stuff, and then it sort of bootstraps itself up farther and farther. And this is not the panpsychist picture. That's the emergence picture, though.
Call it disclosure problem. It's kind of the inverse of combination problem, that you have something like this.
Yes, of course. No, I'm not denying that. No, in fact, what my point is, hylozoism and panpsychism are addressing the same issue from opposite directions. That's the point. It's just they're not the same position. And the point is we tend to look at this from the purely bottom-up standpoint. Right? From the standpoint of emerging, right? Emergence about going up, right? And that's where the hylozoism is the dominant way of talking about this. But panpsychism is addressing the same issue, but going from the top down, basically, right? From the mind being fully realized through everything. So it's a different kind of, so it's a different metaphysical starting point, but basically trying to deal with the same issue. And again, if you remember what I said in the beginning of the talk, from the so-called neutral monism, right, where there's a sense in which you're imagining the universe is kind of unified, right? That is kind of given as a starting principle. The question is, what is it unified as, right? And how does it work that way? So you're denying a dualism in this kind of sense that was big in the late 19th century, where somehow there's a spiritual world that, you know, is God and is independent of what the real, you know, the material world is. You're denying that. But otherwise, there's a question about how exactly does this unity happen? Is it from the bottom up or the top down? That's kind of what the difference is. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, thank you, there's more people. So.
Are you sure? No, you sure? Okay. Okay, so this gentleman here, and can we take all three and then just nobody else? Yeah. Okay, use it.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I wanted to prompt you to talk about the theological dimensions.
See, you're going to regret this.
So I guess I have sort of three things in mind. The first is, if we want to say, it seems you wanted to say that there's some way in which Christianity or certain interpretations of Christianity permeated philosophical metaphysical thinking in the 19th century.
Sure.
There's a historical story to tell about why or how, that I wonder if you have thoughts on.
Well, I mean, actually, I think it was given. I mean, there's a sense in which what the 19th century was about was largely, you know, from the standpoint of theology, you know, because again, you have to think about all these things that start to happen with the establishment of the modern university in Europe, Humboldt and all that, where you start to get this stronger distinction between pastoral theology and so-called scientific critical theology, right? And the critical theology moving in a more scientific direction. So, the way those guys were understanding the Bible, let's say, was in terms of wheat and chaff, right? Namely, what is it that we still want to preserve of this as we move into this post-superstitious era? It wasn't about atheism per se, but it was about trying to figure out what is it we can leave behind, what is it we should accept, and how we can normalize what results with the emerging scientific worldview, right? That's what critical historical theology was largely about. And it seems to me German idealism is very much part of that. Right, and all the stuff after that is part of that too. So the Christianity is already there, you might say, from the get-go. It's already there, and then the question is trying to, you know, so the metaphysics becomes this way of making it palatable to a sort of secular post-religious audience.
But this is also sort of interesting. Is it seems that's right, but it's not just the case that there are Christian sort of teachings which are then reconciled with scientific findings. But there's also a way in which Christian teachings become kind of principles of philosophical reason.
Sure.
Like Christian eschatology, Christology in particular, they don't become dogmas that are affirmed by philosophers, but they become principles of philosophy, at least for like the German idealists. And that's maybe a further sort of permeation, I guess.
Oh yes, but see, this is the thing that I think keeps these guys grounded in the idea they have to reconcile matter and mind in some way. Right? The person of Jesus keeps them focused. Right, so they're not going to be, because, you know, it was, I don't know if you guys know this, but in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, there was a kind of move, especially once the Quran got translated into English, because, you know, the Allah is a very transcendent God, right, much more transcendent than in Christianity, and there was a move among many of the Enlightened people to think, well, this is the most advanced religion, right, because in a sense, the spirituality is completely transcendent of matter. right? And German idealism doesn't go down that route, right? German idealism, see, this is where I made this point in the beginning about the distinctiveness of Christianity from both Judaism and Islam in this regard, right? That Jesus does matter, because this is where the kind of convergence, optimized convergence of matter and mind occurs.
One final thing, hopefully very quick. I feel entitled to ask this just because you mentioned Russian cosmism and you mentioned Schelling, but you didn't mention Russian sociology or Vladimir Soloviev. I have a question.
Oh, the Hegelian guy, the guy who brought Hegel into
Yeah,
Russia.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And just, I asked because, in particular...
Yeah, I've got an article, I talk about him in an article I've sent you in the History of Human Sciences. Yeah.
Oh, no way, awesome. Yeah.
I can send it to you too, by the way.
Yeah, please do. I mean, I'm just curious, he'd written a sort of wonderful essay on Auguste Comte and the idea of humanity in Auguste Comte.
Yeah, well, I held the chair.
Yeah. I mean, he argues something that seems quite like this sort of transhumanism.
Well, there you go, man. It's all joined up now. Yes.
Okay,
No. There is a reason for all this. Yes. I'm sort of on top of that. But I can send you the article. I can send you that.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. But it's something worth looking at, by the way. I don't know if you know. There is this book by a guy named Young on Russian cosmism, which is based on actually having read all the original stuff. And so Oxford University Press published it only about 5-6 years ago. And if you want to get like the whole stream of this, Soloviev and all these other guys to the present day, it's there. I can give you more details about it if you contact me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, okay, you two.
Hi, thank you for your time and talk. What is the origin of matter? Oh, I have two questions. One,
what is the origin of matter? Is that the first one? Damn.
Panpsychism.
What if you're... Oh.
What is the origin of matter in panpsychism?
Well, matter is the fallen state of mind. I mean, I think matter is just given, but given in a negative sense. I mean, we were talking earlier, one of the questioners was raising this issue about the kind of normative standing of things. Matter is kind of mind in its worst state, you might say. I think that's the way to, I think that's kind of what you would say.
Mind is essentially it's the source of existence in panpsychism. So, matter is a secondary corruption of mind? Like, does it follow after?
No, well, good question. Good question. No, you're right. In that sense, it has a kind of, this is where the difficulties with Christianity and stuff like that comes in, I would say, in that kind of question. Yeah, because I think what you have to assume, I mean, what you said that, and this is true if you look at German idealism, right? There's a sense in which, in the beginning, as it were, of the story that's being given, that matter is, is mind in its zero state, and then it unfolds, it awakens, it becomes something. So you have to imagine in the beginning there was this kind of unawakened mind, which is what we call matter. I think that's kind of the way to put it. Whether that's satisfying, I understand the issue here. It's not that satisfying.
Yeah,
but that's kind of what
matter, mind, matter. Like it's like in that instance, but it's still kind of hard to tell which one starts and which one follows.
Well, no. See, this is the thing. Again, it's monism, guy. I mean, mind and matter have to be seen as the same in different states.
Okay, so the second question being, in the as far as when we're talking about like monks and like priestly people that over time have a greater sense of unity, in the goal of aspiring to greater complexity, wouldn't it then be a greater qualitative complexity to continue more in that tradition than to be dependent on technology, which would expand the mind but is still inherently corrupted because it's made by corrupted stuff?
Hey, have you not heard of creative destruction? I mean, the point is technology is constantly replacing itself. Technology is not permanent. I'm sorry. No, but the point is I think you have to understand technology not as something that's permanent, but something that's ever changing. In this respect, capitalism offers some kind of guidance on the matter, actually, in terms of increasing the dynamism. So you're not dependent on any particular technology forever.
Right, so wouldn't those traditions that exercise that ascending level of complexity, wouldn't those that don't
It's not necessarily about ascending a level of complexity, but I mean, I mean, look, the thing is, you have to assume that change will occur. We're not being more dependent on something indefinitely. That's all I would say. I mean, can we move to the last question?
Yeah, no, we're gonna have to.
Oh, we're gonna have to end this. Are you sure? Are you sure? I don't know.
Can you save it for the panel discussion this afternoon?
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry about this.
So I want to thank this guy.
Well, thank you.